This is the painting I want to talk about today. It's a nice day to, not that any day wouldn't be nice to talk about this, but I just taught my last class of the quarter just about 2 hours ago, and consider myself to be something of a Zoom veteran after not even having heard of Zoom 3 months ago. So I don't know if that is a laurel or not, but here I am. And so it's really lovely to be with you all this evening to teach again and think about teaching with all of you. And this is a painting you're looking at that I have taught to the students this fall in the course Art 1B. And I find as I get older, I'm 56 years old, I find that the paintings I tend to talk about, particularly in my beloved 17th century, tend to portray youth and age more and more specifically. And then before I know it, it seems like what I'm teaching is whether I am able to teach. And in this case, it would be like, what happens when an older person proposes to transmit something, knowledge, let's say, maybe even wisdom to a younger person? It's a kind of myth that we subscribe to, I suppose. It's the legendary stuff of any worthy course catalog or promotional material that any university would send, where there's a picture of an inspiring professor and really interested looking students and so on. But let's actually just not take it for granted that teaching is possible, even as we continue to dream that it can happen. Velasquez picture for me is a chance to do that. And here's my one other statement about that before we rush right in is, I've really learned over the years for myself, but also for my students, that art history it's not seeking its powers when it asks students merely to know meanings, interpretations, and so on. It's at its best when it can actually make works of art, such as this one by Velasquez, which you can see in London at the Apsley House there, into philosophical objects, meaning basically objects that match, say, great books that we've read and that have changed our lives. There's no reason why a oil painting on the wall someplace where we may happen to be cannot have the similar transformative power. So this picture is doing that for me, and whether or not it does it for you, I encourage you to think the next time you're at a museum, whenever they do reopen, to approach a picture or some pictures with this in mind, that they can actually open up worlds for us and tell us ways of being. So in this picture, we have the older man with his hair cut close, short cropped, with his left hand on an earthenware jug, which is the foremost thing in this picture, which, to give you a sense of scale, is about 40 inches high. And this older man with the close cropped hair, wearing this cloak with its the sleeve on purpose opened up there at the shoulder, is extending a glass of water to a young boy who, in a very courtly gesture, receives it. If we look closely at that glass, it's really interesting because, first of all, it is absolutely full, almost full to the brim, with pure water. In the middle of it, I think you can see, is a kind of light bulb shaped dark object, which, as far as I know, no one has really been able to understand definitively what it is, but it may be an imperfection, or perhaps like a intentionally beautiful imperfection in the blown glass. It might be a piece of fruit, like a fig, maybe. It's not clear. With this detail, notice also, in addition to the exchange there with both hands on the glass, the two different vessels, the big, thick, rounded vessel that's associated with the older man on the right, and you can see the incredibly detailed and illusionistic water that is cascading, condensation that's cascading down the horizontal grooves of the pot. And then on the left, the sort of more curious to our eyes pot with the different kinds of indentations, which is on a table and is associated with the younger person. So coming back to the picture as a whole, you could say, you know, the big rounded vessel in the foreground, which presumably rests on a bench that we can't see, is associated in its tonality, its rotundity, with the man who holds it and who has carried it maybe through means of donkey, mule, etc., and is now extending a glass of water to this boy. There is, of course, a third figure who is more obscure in the background, who is quaffing from a glass. And his obscurity, I don't think is intentional. I think if you look at some of the copies that Velasquez made of this work, there's one, for example, at the Uffizi in Florence. The third figure is much more prominent, but in any case, one of the ways I really like this painting, this version the most, which is the most famous of the versions Velasquez did, is precisely to do with that unintentional obscurity of the third figure, which for me intensifies the fundamental exchange in the foreground. Now, what is the nature of that exchange beyond being, I guess, like a transaction that Velasquez would have known well from his native town of Seville? Well, transaction is one thing to say right away, since we don't see any money change hands. So although this picture is sometimes called the Water Cellar of Seville, I've chosen the more, I don't know, left money out of it, and I'm going with the alternative title, Water Carrier. And in any case, we do not see any money. I focus on the solemnity of the older man with his creased brow, his sort of frowny face, his gaze down towards the water, but perhaps also past the water. And I think about where that water came from, and hence where he, the water carrier, came from. And although I am not versed enough in, I don't know, the water carrying culture of 17th century Seville, I think of two places which are both, if you like, pure. A mountain stream way up in the mountains where the water runs cold and pure, and then also maybe an aquifer underground where the same kind of clarity and purity of a life-giving fluid, a necessary fluid, can be found. So this man, although he is here, if not in a tavern, then maybe just outside the tavern with the table on the left, has come from afar, and he brings, we can say, a weight coming from some place that we don't see every day necessarily, like a depth or a height. So the older person is associated with weight, gravity, height and depth and purity. And then in this exchange, he is carefully transmitting all of this, not just the water, but his experience to the boy. And, if you might be thinking like, well, wait a minute, I mean, what's to do with Velasquez's own intentions? I'm a little less concerned with those, again, going back to this idea of a work of art as a philosophical object. I think provided we're respectful, thoughtful, and approach a work of art in a genuine spirit of questioning and wonderment, seriousness, I don't see that there's any reason why we have to limit ourselves to known facts, which in the case of this work, as in many works, are going to be very few indeed anyway. Perhaps the most we could say about Velasquez is that he was himself a very young person when he painted this. He was obviously an incredibly gifted painter. He painted it when he was about 20 years old, and he was an apprentice to a teacher at this time. So something to do with the transmission of objects, knowledge, experience, etc., between generations is applicable here. I'll say one other thing about the older man and the jug in particular, which is to come back now to, a bigger detail of this jug. When I look at it, maybe this is self-serving, but I do see the water dripping down it as, of course, just water. But I also see it as tears, as suggesting something to do with the gravity and seriousness, if not sort of tragic connotations of this man. His labor in part, which is sort of rhymed with the labor that it would take to make this pot. His connection to the earth, which is implied in his cloak and in the clay pot itself, not to mention the water. So, if we were to stop here, we could just say, okay, so the professor is saying, as indeed I started in my own thoughts a while ago, a year ago, thinking about this, like, oh, this is great, because this is showing what it is to be the sort of honorific dignity and humility of being an older person who is just, if only by virtue of being older, has accumulated more weight of experience, has maybe been to more places, even just emotionally and psychologically, if not geographically, than a younger person just by dint of years. But as I taught this to some students in SLE, we're talking about this, and I was saying that the young boy seems to be, I don't know, a model student from my perspective, like really the kind of student who would write me a nice email or something like that, like someone who is approaching what it's fair to think of as the social contract of the classroom, where we all kind of agree that there's a certain ritual or ceremony that's going on here, and we put away our phones and pay attention and try to give one another the benefit of the doubt. That this young boy, in my estimation, seems to be like really receiving the knowledge, not only courteously, but respectfully, and moreover in a way that I think very movingly has to do with the two hands being on the vessel at the same time, that there's not only a baton here, a baton implication of passing knowledge on, but also just a shared moment, which is delicate, balanced, pure. I have felt it to be pure in teaching sometimes, where someone says something, you say something, and it just feels like we're all, just for that moment, just very fleeting, but we're all balanced together. There's a moment, it's in a moment. And, that glass takes on an almost kind of sacred quality for me in that sense. And if that sounds overly mythic, I don't think you can really be a professor or be a teacher without having faith in the kind of otherworldliness or the miraculous nature of what it is one does or can set in motion. If that's not the case, then I think one becomes, well, sometimes a cynic, sometimes just simply jaded, other times indifferent, other times just not sufficiently attuned to the magic of it, the specialness of it. In any case, the SLE students, as students often do for me, pointed out something that's a little different or a little bit of a jam or block in my seemingly very positive reading of teaching. And they said it very respectfully, but what they said is this, that if you really look at the picture, the young boy in the foreground isn't really looking at the water carrier. He's sort of looking past him. And by that token, the water carrier himself though he's convincingly in the orbit of the young person, is also seems to be curiously remote or removed from him. And then the third figure, accidentally or not, does seem like a kind of interloper, and also to be kind of a separate figure too. So, you know, adjusting my eyes, I suddenly saw, well, actually, yes, this believable fiction of three figures together in a kind of persuasive setting actually seems to be three separate figures, and three separate figures in a way that's very explicable in terms of how someone, even Velasquez, would make a painting like this, which would be not to show, not to have three models posing simultaneously, not that at all, but probably to pose each model separately, and then to kind of coagulate the three studies of the models done separately into a more or less believable fiction. So if you imagine the water carrier, you know, as a gentleman who is posing alone in Velasquez's studio, and this gentleman I think does appear in other pictures by Velasquez, so a professional model or a hired model, he knows that he's part of a fiction or a story that will be completed, wherein he's supposed to hand a glass to a boy, and who knows if he was really holding a glass, he might have been holding a stick or something like that in the drawing. In any case, but he's all alone. He's alone with his thoughts as being just self-absorbed in the process of modeling. Same with the young boy too. Like, he knows in a separate modeling session he's supposed to act like he's receiving a glass, fine. But in the final painting, I think in a way that doesn't discredit it at all, but in fact enriches it, we have a sense that these two worlds don't quite meet, and that the sharp, gentle but decisive diagonal of the water carrier's earth-colored smock, as it flows down from his chest down to his waist, makes a perfect dividing line between his world and the darker paleted world of the young boy. And so as this relates to teaching, you can imagine that it throws a whole different set of questions in our midst. One would be simply that the teacher imagines, or is maybe willing to believe, the older person that is, that he's transmitting something pure to someone else, but he does so from a position of radical isolation. And for me, you know, coming back to the pot, the vessel, you know, the concentric circles implied of the vessel express that circularity of the professor's knowledge. And here it seems like I've gone from the heights of self-praise at the start about what teaching is to almost like a little too low here in terms of saying something like this. The teacher is going sort of there and performing and so on and in the room, but really what he or she is doing is a very sort of self-circulating or circular enterprise, you know, where maybe they're teaching themselves more than anything. And the way of meditating on, or the occasion of holding forth for others, is finally only a way to think for oneself. It's not necessarily selfish or narcissistic. I mean, there may be goodwill, but finally, if you really peer into the engine room of teaching, what you're going to see is the teacher circulating their own energies, going back and forth. And maybe by that token, the younger person in the room is also involved in their own world. who is there too in the name of, the social contract, but is thinking other thoughts. Maybe those other thoughts are made possible, even as they don't relate exactly to what the professor is saying, are nonetheless made possible by the professor's words. The professor's words are a kind of catalyst for thoughts elsewhere about other things that don't concern the professor, that finally don't concern who the professor is, where he's been, what knowledge he has, what tears, what gravity, what tears, what sadness, what age, And if we left it at that, which maybe we should, could just say, it's poignant being a teacher. And maybe that's my grand realization, not very, maybe a pretty obvious kind of to sir with love type realization. I get it. And, I wish I could be more extravagant in my philosophical, quote unquote, takeaways from my 28 years of teaching, but maybe simplicity is nice. It's moving. And one of the ways it's moving is in the way one doesn't really know to whom one extends that water, who takes it. And maybe it's moving in the way that one doesn't need to know. And that however it is that what we do is delivered it's not our concern to know if it lands or takes, But maybe what is most important, and this is my last comment, is we, students, teachers, continue to believe in the fiction of our togetherness in one room and our possibilities to learn from one another, in that learning to walk that fine line, that magic fine line between coming together and yet being extremely, radically alone with our thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
You're welcome.
Are you ready for some questions from everybody?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful. We've had some incredible comments. Emmy says, what jumps out at me from this painting is the concept of three persons, three hands, three vessels. Diego, Spanish Catholic, portraying the Trinity, three persons in one God. What are your thoughts on that? And then Mike also commented that the glass has a chalice type shape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love both those comments. I would say that there is something sacramental about it, yes, and that although I didn't use exactly these terms, teaching and learning are both forms of grace. In Silicon Valley and elsewhere, I think we mistake teaching as a more or less bloodless informational transaction. And I think both comments speak to a much higher possibility for what it means to convene the generations in an educational setting, which there's a grace to that.
This ties in nicely to Arturo's question, which is there any writing about the spiritual journey in the life of Velasquez? Maybe his personal written reflections or personal journaling?
Well, he became court painter to the King of Spain very shortly after this painting was made. He actually took this painting with him from Seville to Madrid. And it was probably partly on the basis of this painting that he secured at a very young age the most prestigious role as painter in all of Spain. So spiritual, I would say Catholic, and I would say, making pictures that are to do with Catholic faith, Catholic dogma, etc. But I will say this in terms of a spiritual journey more broadly, is Velasquez's most famous painting is one he made some 3.5 decades after this one. It's called Las Meninas, and it's at the Prado in Madrid. And he painted this in 1656, 4 years before his death. And it's a painting in which he tries to establish the intellectual nobility of painting, painting as more than just a manual craft, because even for Velasquez, court painter to the King of Spain, he was still regarded as basically having the skills of a cobbler or a cooper, shoemaker, etc. And I think his efforts there were to demonstrate there at the end of a long career that painting is a philosophy. And the second thing I'll say is, what's fascinating is some of the same figures, ways of depicting the human figure, situations, etc., are apparent in Las Meninas, as in the picture we've just seen, even spread apart across 35 years. And what I take away from that, and what I tell my students often with other paintings too, is, you know, you all can take this for what it's worth. This is just my view. But as much as we change, you know, I feel like I'm the same person I was when I was 18. And that art, or the consideration of art, for example, reading the same novel at age 18 as a college freshman, and then again as a middle-aged person, and connecting with it in different ways that yet nonetheless connect the two ages in one's life, is a way of, is itself a kind of grace, because, you know, we live in a kind of disenchanted consecutiveness, you know, first this, then that, then you do this, then there's that, and it's daily in part, you know, I have this class, I have this to do, I have to this email, but it's also, it goes in years and stages of life, and we tend to mistake life as being just so many consecutive stages, whereas, just to use Velasquez's work as an example, like we return to the same things, we do variations on the same things, we remain in some beautiful ways, we remain who we were.
I love that. I have books that I read time in every 5 to 10 years too, so.
Yes.
Question, what is, from an anonymous attendee, what is the purpose of the second jar? It seems to be more purposefully artistic as opposed to purely functional object, to the purely functional object than the one that's in the jar that's in the foreground.
Yes, that's a great question. I think, I don't know the exact purpose of it, but I agree that it's much more aesthetically various and refined and higher up. And I guess it emphasizes the humble earthiness of the water carrier's jug, and it suggests the greater refinement of the boy. You know, beyond that, I'm not sure, but I agree that, you know, details like that, the play between the two jugs, really is suggestive. And it reminds me of something I tell my students, which is, I think, just quoting Plato, which is that the world is not seen because it is visible because it is seen. And what I take that to mean is, we don't notice things until someone points them out. So this comment about the two jugs is a way of making the world visible because it is seen.
Somebody's asked, could we look more closely at the hands on the glass? It looks like the old guy has a pretty tight grip, firm thumb on the glass, while the boy's hands look not quite ready to take the glass, only one finger around the stem.
Yeah, I can, if you want, Alexa, I can go back to the images.
Sure. Oh yeah, I sort of missed that. It was only the one finger around it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very nicely observed. I think in my scheme, one could understand that in different ways. I'm noticing, for example, the way the kind of knuckly, gnarly mass of the man's hand actually has unexpected echoes with the smaller jug, with its indentations and its kind of protuberances and things like that, as well as its compact mass. But on the subject of the heavier hand, yeah, I guess you'd say it's a supportive hand, right? It's the hand that needs, as in a restaurant, when the server delivers the food, they need to have the firm, supportive hand. And then, yes, the boy's gesture, in a way that may signify social class, is lighter and more, decorous, and he's taking possession of it in a very courtly way. He's not, at the very least, ripping it out of the guy's hand, but even at the same time, he's just taking it very gently. So I really like that observation.
Mm. Yeah, and then Katie asked, sort of building on that, can this painting be seen as a statement on class struggle? An older man from a lower class with torn clothes serving a younger man for a higher class with some disdain and therefore not looking at the boy.
Yes, I'm sure it could. I'd need to know more about the social history of 17th century Spain and then Velasquez's place in it. But, I think one could understand Velasquez in two ways. One is, he's not noble born, although he was at pains to demonstrate his noble birth around the time of the painting Las Meninas I spoke of. And, it was a matter of like reference checking if he was going to be given the courtly status that he really wished for, to make sure that, for example, his grandparents were nobles and so on. And we can't underestimate not only the class divisions that the questioner asks about, but of certain of artists' adherence to those class traditions. And, it's really only in the 19th century that art like this in the Romantic era starts to become romanticized as depicting different forms of working class alienation. For example, Las Meninas, the Maids of Honor, it's called, so not titled after the Infanta, the little Spanish princess, achieved that title only in 1843 in the age of Karl Marx. So by that same token, it'd be fascinating to know how the Water Carrier of Seville was understood in the 19th century England of Charles Dickens and Karl Marx. And the class reading the questioner wonders about would be right there. But I'm not sure if that was Velázquez's role. He might have thought of this as a perfectly ordinary and appealing portrayal of divisions. The past is a remote place, is a foreign country. But I will say this: I think so many of Velázquez's great paintings focus in a very moving way, like this one, on what we would call working class people. And I agree that the Water Carrier is by far the star of the show, and his dignity is what is indisputable, not just through the foreground, but his foregroundedness, but also through the indisputable brilliance of the way he's painted. And I would say the empathic, empathy is itself a 19th century term, so that's anachronistic, but the way the artist identifies with this figure, gives him a kind of autonomy from the boy. And, that's an interesting thing right there. And I'll just put it like this, and it's such a fascinating thing to teach students about or wonder with them about, which is, everyone understandably wants to connect art to a social context. You can do that, and it's important in many respects, and sometimes there are really powerful ways of that. So some of you who took art history classes will recall probably from your professors how they did that. At the same time, and this is just my opinion, I think there's something radically autonomous and mysterious and separate, that is, in a work of art from the social world it comes from. So, you know, 99% of Seville in 1619 has disappeared as being, through accident or not, as being degradable, as being ephemeral, just part of ordinary existence, like this day on earth is degradable. But a painting, and you know, I'm an art historian, so of course you expect me to say this, but I do like art. A painting is a kind of ceremonial separation from that stream of life and would try to show us something that is not reducible to social facts, but instead is a space, a place, a basis for us to dream and think.
So then in looking at the past, Arturo asks, do we know who the patron was that financed the making of this painting and when it was made and what, if there was a purpose behind that?
Yeah, I don't know. I know, at least not as of this recording, I do not know, but Velasquez made several pictures which are quite worked up and involved, and though they may be, if you like, diploma pieces, that is, pieces made for himself to demonstrate precisely the excellence of his ability. There's another one called, it's often called The Old Woman Cooking Eggs, which is in the National Gallery in Edinburgh, which you'll see if you Google it, is very similar in its basic setup to this. They're so worked up and elaborate that they do suggest a patron, Arturo, you're right. I just don't know for whom they were painted. And even if I did know, I might say that that knowledge ultimately still brings us back to a question of the magic of the painting itself and it as a kind of autonomous fantasy of the painter's hand.
The boy receiving the water seems to be watching in the direction of the heart, the chest of the water carrier. Is that be another possibility? Maybe rather than isolation, it might represent more intimacy if we think the young boy is looking into the heart of the water carrier.
Oh, that's great, yeah. I wonder if we could agree that both, however contradictory, could be true, that when we, you know, if you accept the premise that the boy is actually posing separately and thus there's no one there as he plays out the fantasy of this transaction, if nonetheless just inadvertently or inadvertently on purpose, that very stare into nothing is also a stare at the heart. I really like that a lot. We say we look into the heart of someone, I don't know, sometimes there can be that form of would-be empathy can be very aggressive and, or as we say, intrusive, right?
Yeah.
So the way that one can be both looking at the heart, but also lost in a gaze that finally dissipates in thin air. I not only like that, I guess, ethically, I like it because maybe it's true to life, you know? I just think from my point of view as a teacher, like sometimes these, you know, incredible moments that make teaching worthwhile, where you feel like, oh, someone is really sort of seeing or getting what this is about, and this is a very intense topic, whatever it might be for me, and you know, I feel that there's a resonance, but then they might be just dazing off into space, you know. And I think as I get older, I just feel like that's okay. You know, I'm trying to just be okay with that, you know, that it's like, I'll just tell you all this, like when I give my lectures, and who knows the next time I'll actually physically walk to campus to give a lecture, because it's not going to be next year, I'll tell you that. I'll be teaching from this room all next year. But what I like to do is go in I like to leave my house. I live in Palo Alto with just like, I know from the walk with it. So I get there with like 1 or 2 minutes to spare before the lecture begins. And I like that because, well, here I'm in this lecture, I'm obviously using my conversational voice, but in my lecturing in Cubberley Auditorium, dear departed or soon to be departed Cubberley Auditorium, I have a booming oratorical voice. So I like, since I'm a pretty mellow dude, I need to have that adrenaline rush of coming in and, you know, it's 10:29 and I come in, I have to plug in all my cords for my computer, which is not second nature for me. And I wish I were an English professor because I could just open the novel, et cetera, et cetera. And I need to have my heart really racing, like I'm messing this up, I'm gonna mess this up, I'm gonna, you know, what am I gonna say, what's the start? And then that whole adrenaline rush is what, yes, helps me to give a lecture, but it's also maybe not helpful in terms of the very subtle response that the questioner wonders about, which, you know, in other words, because I'm so intense and focused and this is meaningful and I'm just ready to go and I'm ready to say how important this is and I want you to feel it's important too, like I have this kind of unnatural expectation that every lecture has to be an epicenter, you know, and maybe as I get, yeah, well, it does need to be an epicenter in performance in the sense that every lecture better be a last lecture in the sense that you better give it seriously for all, as though this is it. This is the last lecture. That I agree with, because otherwise I don't get it. But I think where I could maybe, as it were, step back a little is in like allowing for the kind of peaceable mysteries of non-transaction or would-be connection that aren't connection that just happen in a classroom. And it's not as though I'm not aware of those things and it's not as though I don't respect them, but I think I could do still more to really cherish them.
Tracy asks why the interloper is the only one who makes eye contact with the painting's viewer. And Stacy also asked a question about the third figure, wanting to know, and perhaps they build on each other, how that third figure plays a role, if he does, in your ideas about grace and teaching.
Such a good question. If the third figure could speak to me now, he'd be saying, hey, why didn't you talk more about me? I'm in the painting too. I can't believe this. So unfair. He suggestively mediates between the two. His haircut seems similar to the older man's haircut. He's kind of, maybe there are paintings that are called the 3 ages of man that one sees in museums, and maybe it's not the 3 ages one might think of, but there are 3 different ages here. But more suggestively, he could represent in his unintentionally kind of phantom-like appearance as he fades into paint, just pure paint, the meeting point between the two, you know, that there's some kind of imaginary composite person that the teacher and the student conspire to create in the fiction of learning and teaching, you know, where some third figure appears fantastically, who's maybe eagerly quaffing the beverage that's being given, the life-giving, thirst-quenching drink, but who is a figment of both parties' imagination, you know, who doesn't really exist in the sense that the two principal figures don't really acknowledge him, and yet who is central, who is more important than either one of the other two. You know, it's like the dream of teaching, dream indeed, is not finally to do with the teacher or the student, it's with the being that the two make together.
So then when reading a piece of art as philosophy, when you're teaching, how do you separate the philosophy of its time from our modern philosophical thoughts? How do we avoid being anachronistic?
I think we cannot avoid that. I think it's a great question in this way. I think many of the Stanford students who take my course are probably taking their only art history course. I don't know for a fact, but it's just a sense I get. Although it's possible to be compelling by saying that I'm going to take you to the world of Seville in this moment, and we're going to really kind of bear down on different questions that govern that moment. I've found in teaching over the years that, and this is tendentious, but I'll just say it, that it's a closed form of teaching. It basically closes off the picture and turns it into, no matter how well done the excursus might be, it turns it into a kind of right answer. And no doubt there's something electrifying about right answers sometimes. You know, in art history, you know, it's really exciting when someone can demonstrate that some chapel, some altarpiece in a chapel in a church in Florence was actually, you know, like in another chapel in the same church, 30 yards to the right, you know, and the documents have emerged suddenly out of the rust and dust of time to show that that's indisputably true. That's like a Sherlock Holmes moment, like a solution that is just epiphanic. Mm-hmm. However, for the most part, when art historians or anyone gets up there and says, this is how it is, here it is, X, Y, Z, it can be illuminating if it's done with grace, but I think it's fundamentally a closed thing. And I would prefer, in my 50 minutes, 3 times each a week, to just think about, like, how can I connect these pictures to my students' lives now? And do so with the following caveat, that the real relation, the real connection is never about just sort of glomming our own concerns and attitudes, our own presentisms onto the past, because that is not a form of grace. There has to be always, you know, I think what Emerson called a rough, rasping friction between your own ideas and what the thing you're thinking about will give you. And in that friction, I think one feels the resistance of the past as its object to what one would say about it. But I think one also, in philosophizing about it, opens it up in a way that is, yes, I think it is anachronistic in many ways, but it's a purposeful anachronism, or to put it's a necessary anachronism, or to put a slightly more honorific term on it, it is a poetic anachronism. And when I say honorific, I mean a poet looking at this painting would never stop to like study, you know, pot turning in 17th century Spain. They would go right to whatever was important for them now. And if they're a good poet, move us and change our lives. In my own small and inadequate way, I think as a teacher, I think that's where that's what I aim for.
Dave Rowe had an interesting comment about that, where he said, it's interesting in the questions. It's interesting how we look at current times as so different and representing a cultural descent via technology and social media. We're said to be distracted, not present, etc. However, the teacher and student in this picture appear distant and possibly focusing beyond the picture's main event, representing the modern day masses seemingly drifting through life. The interloper seems most interested in the water exchange, similar to the voyeuresque lifestyle of today, with people being more interested in reality, TV, social media following, and celeb watching than their own lives. Perhaps we're not so different after all.
So just to understand that, Dave, so the shadowy figure is the most attentive figure. Is that right, Alexa? Is that what Dave is saying?
I believe so, but Dave, if you're interested in commenting on this, Dave, who put this up, raise your hand and I will let you expand.
I think I understand the question. I just wanted to be sure.
Yes, I believe that's
yeah. Well, let me say this. It's funny Dave says that, because I would kind of see it the other way. Yes, people can be distracted gazing off into space. People also can be what's called lost in thought, and I would nominate the 2 frontal figures for that. And I think being lost in thought, in the same way as being lost in an era of GPS, is a rare phenomenon, or a rarer phenomenon. now. And so when I look at these figures, I see them as, if you like, pre-digital, in the sense that they are absorbed in their solitude and comfortable with it. As we think about, you know, one of the things I really think about with my students, like what is my purpose as a teacher? It is partly, maybe mainly, to make my students, or encourage my students, to be okay with their own with their own solitude. You know, that solitude is a sort of resource-filled state, and it's not automatically to be connected or to be understood in terms of disconnection and fear of missing out and all of that, you know? So to me, the shadowy figure is more the TV watcher who's avidly consuming. In terms of the distinction between then and now, it's a good question. I'm sure some things never change under the sun. You could ask, as we look at the left hand of the water carrier on the earthen jug, if our own, for example, our own sense of tactility is historically as subtle as that man's was, or for that matter, as Velázquez's was with the brush, for the simple Zoomified reason that even pre-COVID, we're obviously all not reliant upon rounded, phenomenal, earthen objects in presumably the way that this man is. So I think, you know, there's probably a historical difference having to do with the tactility of the world, physicality of experience, and that we are probably on the sort of remote edges of this painting's definition of the human. You know, we're maybe in a last generation that's able to actually relate to actually seeing a real oil painting in a museum, you know, before they just become all virtualized. As I must say, my students sometimes, and they're very well-meaning, but they breathlessly say that it's so great that now a computer can make all the paintings of Rembrandt, and Professor, you must think this is the most awesome thing you've ever heard. And I don't know, maybe they're disappointed or maybe even actively annoyed when I say, no, I don't think that's a great thing. I think a lot disappears from the world with the disappearance of one-of-a-kind objects and the experience they engender. That always gets into questions of privilege, which are really interesting, but that one person may be able to travel to see the picture, et cetera. And no doubt the history of art is rich in connections to social inequality. There's no question about it. I mean, the very person who painted this is going on to be the court painter to the King of Spain, after all. However, what I say, or propose at least, is that that's not the whole story. When we open ourselves up to works of art and treat them not only as not riddles to be deciphered to prove the superiority of our intelligence, but also when we approach them not as in an attitude of suspicion about their role in creating an unjust society, however much of a role they may have played in that, I think we can, without contradiction, open spaces for us that are important, socially important. Our consciousness is enriched, ergo the consciousness of those with whom we interact in the world is enriched. You can see that you've got a humanities professor speaking, but yes, I do like art. I do believe in novels and things like that, and essays in the spoken lecture, etc. And I suppose, you know, a simple, I don't know if it's a verification, but a simple example of this would be, and I'm sure we've all been there, and I'm being pretty simplistic here in my distinctions, but for however much annoying it would be, and it truly would be annoying to be in the company of really snobby people who are lording it over one another and you or me about how much they know about this, that, or other cultural object, let's say, to prove their own cultural literacy, and therefore, as they say, demonstrate some of their own cultural capital as so much conspicuous consumption. and I talk to my students all about this, however annoying that would be, I think it would probably be equally annoying, and I know it has been for me in my life in many social situations, to be in the company of people who are so resolutely indifferent to any kind of meaningful conversation, who seem to resist their innate powers of being moved and opened up by art. You know, so I feel like I'm kind of between, I teach between those two poles, you know, though I'm caricatured as sometimes as a kind of ivory tower person because of, I think, what you've heard tonight. I think caring a lot about art and reading and thinking and having authors, often canonical authors that one admires, there's nothing necessarily socially dysfunctional about that. It's in what you do with it. Every teacher is imperfect, and from my own imperfection, I just try to teach about what I like and why I like it, in order that my students may themselves be encouraged to affirm not only what it is that they like and why, but that they even have this ability in the first place, because I think many students are discouraged for different reasons from acknowledging how meaningful not just a work of art might be for them, but just experiences in their life, etc. So kind of that's where it's powerful teaching is. Maybe that third figure is that mirage I'm speaking of, you know, where suddenly there's this ghost in the room who's not the teacher and not the student, but is this phantom, this kind of figment of mutual imagination that teacher and student have created, and that becomes real, you know, becomes central. And I would define that figure as a figure of transformation, you know, that the student and maybe the professor are changed, and one is out of the realm of small talk and biding the time on the one hand, and one is out of the realm of the brutally classist way of regarding knowledge and the exchange of thought. That whole thing I just painted for you may be itself a fiction, but every professor, every writer has to have their fantasy of what it is they're doing, and I would say that's very close to mine.